Good morning.
Morning.
It's good to be with you today. I think it's important as we remember, it's important to remember as we go through cold days and challenging weather in different seasons. Sometimes we have a tendency just to see the bad and just see bad weather. But I think if nothing else, I've learned from the story of Joseph is that we need to see that God is in control, and we are not. We are weak, but He is almighty. And so even in seasons of these cold spells, we need to remember that God is in control. We aren't. Because only when we get to that point of humility are we at a point to really begin to understand who God is. Because without really understanding God, we really cannot follow Him and be His servants. So we're looking at Joseph. And the idea I see here, I think the text is pointing out, is that God helps us, like Joseph, to see the bigger picture in difficult situations. Just like in this picture, we tend to have a very limited keyhole view of our world. We make decisions based on very limited knowledge, understanding, and insight. That's why we need to live by faith, because we do not see the big picture as God does. But if we live by faith, we're living according to the bigger picture that God sees rather than the small, limited space that we see through. As you look at the life of Joseph, he faced so many hardships. Some of them came about as a result of his attitude, but some of them just simply came about because of where he was and the path that he was thrown into without his choice. Now, as we look at all these hardships that Joseph goes through, we need to make some application to our lives. That regardless of what we go through, and sometimes it's unjust, sometimes it may be a consequence of our choices, we need to make certain that we do not respond to hardships with hate. We do not need to respond to hardships with a sense of revenge or despair or even self-pity. What we see in Joseph, instead of those responses of hate, revenge, despair, and pity, he chose in difficult situations to respond with faith. That's hard, but it's not impossible. He chose to respond with faith, which gave him the strength of heart to endure so much turmoil, to endure so much injustice in his life. See, that's why we're talking about strength of heart that comes from faith in God. If you profess to be a Christian, then you must live by faith. And if you live by faith, you cannot let the situations and the circumstances dictate who you are, how you think, and what your priorities are. You can't. Then you're no longer living by faith. You're living by faith in the world, but not by faith in God. Because with faith in God and strength of heart, Joseph made a choice. It's the same thing with us. In different situations, we must make a choice of how we respond. Is it a response of faith in God, or is it a response of faith in the world? So with strength of heart from his faith in God, he endured turmoil. He endured injustice so he could serve his Creator. And this is the Creator that he learned about as a precocious young boy. With strength of heart, Joseph chose to serve God. With strength of heart, he chose to be, because of his faith, he chose to be the best slave. He chose to be the ideal prisoner. He chose to be the wisest advisor in Egypt. Because of faith, he chose to be a forgiving brother that put him on a 20-something year journey of hurt, injustice, and pain. We don't need to just throw Joseph's example away. We need to embrace it. Far too often we follow the example of the world of, I'm going to get you because you got me. That's not the way of God. That's not the way of faith. And that doesn't take strength of heart to do that. To do God's will, like Joseph, then you and I must have the strength of heart to endure malicious actions. And in the midst of those malicious actions, we will trust God, because when we want to respond, we're only seeing through the keyhole. We don't see the bigger picture that God is using us in. We're just seeing us in them. That's limited thinking, and that is not faith in God. That's faith in self, faith in culture, faith in societal norms. That's not faith in God. Trusting God, it gives us the strength of heart to stop allowing, and this is crucial, we need to stop allowing human emotion to lead us. We need to stop allowing what we assume to be human reason to lead us. Because neither human emotion or human reason are big enough to enable us to see how we need to respond in the way we see life. We're not God. We never will be, and we will never have the vision of God, but faith forces us, compels us to trust God that His way works, because He sees something more than we do. See, when and if life makes no sense to you, that's when we really need faith to seek God's path, to seek God's guidance, not human reasoning to guide us. We need God's path, not the human path. If we are treated unjustly, and I would dare to say that many of us in here at some point in life have been treated extremely unjustly, well, that means we need great strength of heart to trust God enough to obey Him and to serve Him when it makes no sense from the keyhole view that we have. Because only if and when we see life with God's big picture view, only then will we show mercy and respect to anyone who has mistreated us in any way. That's what Joseph teaches us. You trust God. Don't trust yourself. In Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 26, you begin to see towards the end of the story this narrative unfolding. You discover suddenly 11 men, 11 grown, rough men, who had knelt down, heads bowed to the ground, because they thought they were about to be executed. There was an impressive figure standing above them. It was Egypt's prime minister. Joseph stood there above his 11 terrified half-brothers. 23 years earlier, these 11 jealous men, they abducted their younger brother. They dropped him in a pit, and they left him to die. But then, when they saw an opportunity to make money off of their brother, they sold him as a slave to some passing traders. And it's true when you go back earlier in the story. Joseph, absolutely, he was an arrogant, self-absorbed, 17-year-old brat. He was the favorite son of his father's favorite wife. And Jacob made that extremely clear to the others in the family when he gave Joseph a robe of honor. He would snitch on his brothers. And with arrogance, when he had a dream, he told them that they would all bow down to him someday. And they grew to hate this younger brother. So, when they had the chance to get rid of him, they took it. But in God's providence, God guided Joseph. God protected Joseph as a slave and as a locked up and forgotten prisoner, until one day, after decades, God made him the second most powerful man in Egypt. 23 years after Joseph's fall into chaos began, A severe famine hit the entire region. But there was food in Egypt. So the brothers, they all went to Egypt so they could get food. And they had no idea that the man in charge of dispersing food was their brother Joseph that they had sold to the Midianite traders. As time went by, Joseph, he revealed himself to his brothers. And he told them that he had forgiven them. In Genesis 45, verse 5. Genesis 45, 5. This is Joseph speaking to these men. And now, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here. Do you notice that? He's not grieved with it anymore. He's not angry about it anymore. And he's saying, you shouldn't either, because you acted in the keyhole view of me and I responded in the keyhole view of you, but God has expanded my view because I followed him by faith. God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. See, they wanted to end him. He could have lived to end them. But he suddenly realized life is not about ending others who bring injustice to me. Life is about preserving life so people can come to know God. That's what we as his church should be all about. We should understand that. As people who Jesus died to give life to, then we need to be progenitors of life, spiritual life, not death. He told them to bring their families. And he told them to bring his father to Egypt so that their lives could be preserved, so they would not starve to death. So it's interesting, 16 years after he relocated the family to Egypt, their father Jacob died. And the brothers now were terrified. And it says in chapter 50 of Genesis, verses 15 to 17. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, see, they thought that their father was the protector of them, without realizing that it was God that was the protector of them. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, you know, Joseph is holding a grudge against us. Now, this is interesting that we will notice. Usually when people have wrong ideas about us or assumptions that are wrong about us, it's usually because that's the way they think, not how you think. And these brothers are projecting on Joseph what they would have done. We need to be careful not to do that. So if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. They know, they're owning the suffering they caused him. And they don't see how in the world they would have ever forgiven him if he'd done that to them. So they just don't see how he could forgive them. They're still small, limited keyhole viewers of life and other people. I don't need to see you through my small keyhole. I need to expand it by faith and see you the way God sees you. We've got to stop seeing people from our narrow, limited, small-minded thinking and let our minds be enlarged by the truth of God so that we can live as God in this world. It's a choice you have to make. Every one of us daily either lives by faith in human resources or lives by faith in God. You cannot claim to be a follower of Jesus if you live by faith in human resources. You just aren't. You're lying to yourself and you're deceiving yourself. You can't have two gods, Jesus says. Verse 16, so they sent this message to Joseph. And we don't know from biblical text and context whether this was something they made up to protect themselves or if their father really said it. You can read in the context of knowing the history of these brothers, I get the sense that they were lying like their dad lied when he was younger. Whether or not it was the case, this is what they said. Before he died, your father gave a command. Notice their pronouns. It's not our father, but your father. So you've got to respect your father. Your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph. Please forgive your brothers' transgressions and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Here's Joseph's response. Joseph wept when their message came to him. It doesn't tell us exactly why Joseph wept, but again, as you read the context and try to understand and read between the lines and when you see the bigger picture, I think Joseph may have wept as he, looking at these brothers and hearing their words, supposedly from his father. I think he perhaps wept as he recalled the path that God had led him on to bring him to that day, to that point. I think he remembered that he was thrown into the pit by these brothers. He was sold as a slave by these brothers. All unjust, nothing made sense to him. Then he was imprisoned for doing what was right. I think he may have wept for the lost years with his dad. I think he may have wept when he felt forgotten and abandoned. Whatever the reason was for his weeping, those tears scared his brothers to death. It terrified them. So they fell at his feet and they offered to be his slaves because the tears they saw coming down his face. But instead of vengeance, Joseph lifted them up. Do you hear that? He lifted them up. He built them up. And he told them that they had nothing to fear. Verse 21 of Genesis chapter 50. Listen to his words. Don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. There's a promise to his brothers. And then he comforted them. And he spoke kindly to them. There are three truths that I believe Joseph learned through this horrific journey that enabled him to have the strength of heart to forgive after he had been treated so badly. This is so pertinent to us in our lives. We often don't forgive because we see through our small keyhole and we refuse to see the bigger picture of God. Well, shame on us if we claim to live by faith but don't. Here's the first truth that Joseph learned. We need to learn this as well. Joseph learned he was not God. Oh yeah, we know that. No, we don't. No, we don't. When you make decisions based on your keyhole view of life, you think you're God. But we're not. Chapter 50, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Listen, am I in the place of God? See, Joseph learned, just like you and I should learn, in the University of Hard Knocks. Instead of learning bitterness, we need to learn the truth of the reality of God. Joseph learned that he was not God. That arrogant 17-year-old, at some point early in his life, probably thought he was God or God's most favored child. And his fed-up brothers, they sold him to merchants headed for Egypt. In Egypt, he was sold as a slave to Potiphar. He was the captain of Pharaoh's Egyptian guard. And Joseph, earned Potiphar's trust until Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of trying to violate her. So he was unjustly imprisoned. But again, he earned the respect of two fellow prisoners who'd once worked in the courts of the king or the Pharaoh. And he earned their favor because God enabled him to interpret their dreams. And eventually, God enabled Joseph to correctly interpret Pharaoh's dream. And that's what God used to propel Joseph to become the second in command in Egypt. This is what we need to understand in this story. What Joseph came to understand. The truth is, you and I, we control so very little in our lives. We like to puff ourselves up and think we control, or we have this mind that we're going to be tough and weaponize ourselves and they'll be sorry. That's so small. That's such small-minded thinking. That's faithless. Totally faithless. See, when we're born, where we are born, to whom we are born, what gifts and capabilities we have in our lives, our health, the health of those that we love, what tragedies come into our lives, when we will die, or how we will die. We have no control over those things. We have absolutely no control of anything in our lives except our choice of what perspective to use in life. I can choose to live with a small-minded keyhole view, or I can choose to trust God's view of life. And I will learn of that view as I study His Word and look at these narratives from God's perspective. But like Joseph, we need to trust that God is really with us. 3 times, when Joseph was at his lowest, this is what we're told in chapter 39. 39:2 says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man." 39:21 says, "The Lord is with Joseph and extended kindness to him." 39:23 says, "The Lord is with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful." Do you see the point that Moses is making? When you allow God to be with you, when you allow God to guide you, then you will find the blessings of God. But if you don't let God guide you, if you rely on your keyhole view, you don't get the blessings of God. You're denying them. Doesn't work. See, Joseph's faith in God built his strength of heart that kept him moving forward, and therefore God was able to powerfully use Joseph because Joseph trusted God. Secondly, Joseph learned that God, only God, is sovereign in everything. See, Joseph told his brothers again in chapter 50, verse 20, "You planned evil against me." He knew that. He wasn't denying that. That was a truth he couldn't ignore. I know that you planned evil against me. But what he's saying now is, but God's good and God's purpose can use evil for the betterment of God and His people. You planned evil against me. God planned it for good. Do you hear that? God's plans usurp, override your plans if yours are for bad. So I don't have to worry about what people are doing to me. I trust what God will use it for me. How He will use it for me. God planned it for good to bring about this present result. The survival of many people. Our minds as the church, as Jesus redeemed, as spiritual people, we need to see this and read this as our greatest concern is the spiritual survival of many people. And that demands that we live by faith, not by our small-minded keyhole view of life. So don't despair. Do not despair when bad things happen. Bad things happen, don't they? We all know bad things happen in this world. It's a fallen, broken world, so bad things will happen. But in the midst of all that, we need to remember God is still God. Yeah, but that's not fair. God is still God. But did you see what they said? God is still God. But do you see God is still God. God is still God. He hasn't abandoned us. Injustice doesn't mean God has abandoned us. Hurt, pain does not mean that God has abandoned us. It means we live in a broken world. And God is still able to use the garbage that happens to us. He can use that garbage to bring good things in our lives if we will choose His perspective. When bad things happen, we need the strength of heart to trust that God's big picture will fulfill God's plan. And since I cannot yet see God's big picture, I trust what He's doing in the world. If Joseph had not been obnoxious, he would not have been sold as a slave. If Joseph had not been enslaved, Potiphar would not have bought him. If he had not worked for Potiphar, His wife would not have falsely accused him, and therefore he would not have been thrown into prison. If he had not been in prison, he would not have interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. If he was not in prison when the cupbearer finally remembered him, he would have not been there to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And if he had not interpreted Pharaoh's dream, hundreds of thousands of people would have died in a famine, including his own family. Do you see the point? We may not see immediate results of what we want when things happen, but we've got to trust God's bigger picture. It may happen 20 years down the line, 25 years down the line. But I'm just one step in God's process, and He needs people of faith that trust His view, that trust His process. Do you trust His process? It takes strength of heart to hold on to God when life becomes a gauntlet of unjust events that we simply don't understand. Third, Joseph learned to see the big picture. It's not something you wake up having. It's a skill you develop after years of persevering and following God. Decades of perseverance of following God is the only thing that will ever enable you to begin to get a glimpse of God's big picture. Verse 24 of chapter 50. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid, and God will bring you up from this land to the land He swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God, notice the facts of a future event because he trusts God. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. See, Joseph, at the end of his life, had truly begun to see God's big picture. Joseph remembered God's promise to Abraham, and it didn't take place in a year. It took centuries to fulfill it. He remembered God's promise to Abram that his descendants would be a great people, and that his descendants would occupy the land of Canaan, and that his descendants would bless all peoples on the earth. He realized at the end of his life that his roller coaster life was a very small part of God's much bigger picture. We sometimes assume we are the picture. I need to see the whole working of God in my life. You may not. You may be one small step, one small stone in the line of God's working in the world. But by learning, and we have to learn it, by learning to trust God's promises, that's where Joseph gained the strength of heart to live according to God's bigger picture and not live according to his limited human view. There will absolutely, we know it, we've tasted it, there will absolutely be times in our lives when bad things happen. And when it feels like everything is going wrong. And it feels like God has abandoned us. Where is He? I encourage you. Keep your eyes on God's big picture. And take your eye away from the keyhole, because you're never going to see how life is meant to be through that. That's where faith comes, and that's why we need to listen to God through His Word. Don't just read it to check off, I read the Bible today. Read it so you can see God's big picture that He unfolds from Genesis to Revelation. When Jesus was laid in the borrowed tomb, and that stone was rolled into place, the disciples thought their world had ended, because from their keyhole view, death was the end. But it wasn't over, was it? 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead. So one day, Jesus will return to judge most and reward a few. So until you and I go home, bad things will happen that we just don't understand, that are unjust, and they hurt so deeply. To get through those hard times, we need the strength of heart that can only come from trusting God's big picture more than trusting our limited human view. The emotional and spiritual maturity that accompanied Joseph's strength of heart could only come from his intimate relationship with God that he learned on a daily basis. Joseph, as he looked back over his shoulder in time, Joseph saw God moving. He knew absolutely that God had allowed him to go to Egypt. However, it began with jealous brothers throwing him in a cistern. God allowed him to go to Egypt to direct a program to save people's lives through a harsh famine. You and I cannot live as Jesus' disciples without strength of heart that comes from faith in God, trusting his big picture. We cannot have the strength of heart without a true faith in God. Not just a coming to a building because that's my faith. That's not faith. Do you struggle? Do you ever struggle, if you're honest with yourself, do you ever struggle to see God's purpose in everything that happens in your life? Do you struggle to see God's picture when people are mistreating you? Or mistreating the people you love? Are you limiting your response to your small keyhole view? Or do you trust God's bigger picture? See, if we struggle to forgive those who step on our so-called rights, we don't understand God's big picture. We don't. We're not living by faith. And if you don't live by faith, you will not be greeted by God at the end, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We all need courage. We all need prayers to be patient enough to see God's picture instead of relying on our limited human view. If we align our desires, our attitudes, and our actions with God, that's an if we align ourselves with God, then we will discover his joy, his peace, his hope, and his dreams for our lives. Stop letting your challenges define you and motivate you. Dare to totally entrust your whole life to God. If we can help you on that journey of faith, please come as we stand together as we sing.